in the synagogue. It's a really powerful story. There's a lot of really interesting connections to what's going on right now in our own national life in many of our communities and even families, and I think we're going to get a lot out of it. Before we dive into that, let's take a moment to gather ourselves. We don't have enough space to just come to ourselves, to breathe and to settle in. So let's take some of that space now. And after that, we'll pray, and then we'll launch into our service. Just take 3 deep breaths with me now. Breathe in once. And release. Breathe in one more time. And release. One more, you can do it. Deep breath in, all the way to the tippity top of your lungs, and release. We live in our bodies, even if our brains and our emails tell us otherwise. It's so important to return to our bodies. So tonight, as we delve into these exciting concepts and topics, let's turn our hearts towards God in prayer. Please pray with me now. Holy God, you are a consuming fire, circling round about us, establishing your holy and invigorating presence. You declare that the sea shall occupy its space and the land shall occupy its space. You set Leviathan in the seas and declare that Leviathan shall enjoy his sport within the seas, but go no further. You are the boundary maker. You are also the boundary destroyer, O God, and we lift our hearts to receive the witness of your Son, Jesus, of his proclamation that you are no respecter of persons, that the sun rises on the just and the unjust alike. And we hold tonight, God, this tension within your Holy Scripture, with a witness to your own life toward us. Give us grace now in this moment to hear and to receive this word, and to open ourselves to the possibility of your life moving in and through us, through our society, and through our world. Give us a fresh word tonight, God. We lift all of this up to you in Jesus' most holy and precious name. Amen.
Of the wind, the substance of a force so pale and thin. Let the veil of earth be stretched again. Holy, all behold the holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. Heaven taunts the hearts of men. You can feel it from within, the beauty of it all, and the mystery, the swelling of a voice. Arise and sing. Holy, all behold the holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. You are holy, infinite and holy. A billion suns rise for you, clouds paint the skies for you, mountains stand tall for you, valleys bow down to you, everything rising to sing all our songs to you.
Kings become fools for you, kingdoms to ruins for you. Vapor finds ground in you, music finds sound in you. Everything rising, everything rising, everything rising, everything rising, everything rising. Sing it,
A reading from the Gospel according to St. Mark. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Hear what the Spirit is saying.
I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves 99, lost in the shadows, searching for answers. Still, your love has found the way. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God, yeah. When I broke your heart, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I was yet far, still you drew near to me. You have been so, so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. No, it chases me down, fights till I've found these 99. Lost in the shadows, searching for answers, still your love has found the way. No, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. So shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Snow shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Snow wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. No, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. Lost in the shadows, searching for answers, still your love has found a way. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
Good evening again, and thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we're going to be looking at this phrase that comes up in Mark's gospel, unclean spirits. And often, I think in our own minds, if you've read the gospel before, you automatically associate an unclean spirit with a demon. And to a certain extent, that's true. They're kind of synonymous. But I want to say that there's something else going on here. Why does the gospeler, why does whoever Mark is, go out of their way to describe this spirit as unclean? What is going on there? I think a lot of modern commentators look at that and say, it's so wonderful. Jesus is like the cosmic therapist come to liberate us from our mental illness. And definitely we understand that the idea of demon possession, when we read the ancient texts, a lot of the things that look like possession sound an awful lot or correlate to some of the symptoms, some of the visible evidence of mental illness that we understand today. And so we kind of automatically go to that place and we think this is sort of a primitive way of talking about liberating us from those forces, right? This is before the language of psychology. And that makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Pastorally, the church is fraught with a large group of people who come to the table, literally bringing all of them, including all of their mental illness. I'm one of them. you know, and we do have to think about what are the kinds of tools at our disposal to think through what that means for us. That's important. But I want us to take a step back from that interpretive lens for a moment, because I actually think we miss something so important if we reduce that category, unclean spirits, simply to either a demonology that says, well, these are just the forces that oppose Jesus Christ. If you're a good evangelical, that's what you learn, right? Just like a bunch of other forces that continue to oppose Jesus Christ. So there's that piece. Although we don't really see that this unclean spirit is actually opposed to Jesus. The unclean spirit actually knows who Jesus is, which is really fascinating, and ultimately submits to Jesus. And again, the other piece around the mental illness, a worthy interpretive lens, but it just misses something. So when we think about what makes something unclean, let's step back and ask ourselves, where do we see that language come up today? And the majority of the ways that we might think of things as unclean are as if they are literally dirty, right? Think of things like dirty dishes or laundry. Maybe right now in the middle of a pandemic, we might especially think of contaminated surfaces, okay? When we think of things that are unclean, what we're really talking about is the language of purity and pollution. I'm going to say that again, the language of purity and pollution. And those two categories are so important in helping us understand the logic behind a lot of what's going on in a lot of biblical narrative, particularly in the early formation of the state of Israel. What we see happening in some of the later Torah pieces and some of the early national histories, things like Judges especially. When we think of in our own time, what constitutes pollution, right? Maybe you think of like, if I ask you, what is a pollutant? Maybe you think like plastic water bottles or toxic runoff, right? Or maybe CO2. And think about what makes those things polluting, right? Plastic bottles, when we use them to drink, are really helpful, aren't they? But when they end up in our ocean, marine life chokes on them. It biodegrades into microplastics that end up in our food systems and ultimately might, end up toxifying ourselves as we're eating all these different creatures that are part of that food system. Runoff is another really interesting example. Agricultural runoff is rich in phosphorus and nitrogen, things that on land create for really bountiful harvests, but in the water kill a lot of aquatic life, right? And violently damage our river systems, our lakes, become a really big problem for us in terms of ecological land management. So those two things. CO2 is the biggest one of all, right? Because we are literally facing a global crisis over the fact that like 100 years ago, we decided that all this carbon that was hidden under the earth, in layers and layers of earth, that was really the result of ancient forests that had died being compressed under, thousands of pounds, millions of pounds of cubic pressure being turned into liquid carbon that then we could then extract from the earth. And guess what? When you combust it, when you combine it with air, it creates this molecule CO2 that in the atmosphere has a tendency to trap heat, and it's causing a big problem for us all across the planet. So what do all these pollutants have in common? The thing about pollution is that none of these things are actually inherently bad in themselves, right? There's nothing that's inherently bad about any of them. And in fact, in their right context, they can be quite helpful. They can be a kind of blessing, if you will. But what happens is that they cross a boundary and enter into a space where they don't belong. That's the basic idea behind pollution, right? When we think of this unclean spirit that we encounter in Mark's gospel, what makes this spirit unclean? First, we encounter the spirit in the setting of a synagogue. And it's hard to imagine a worse place for an unclean spirit to find itself. Synagogues are supposed to be a source of community life, spiritual authority, and grappling with the truth of God, right? That was the vision of the rabbinic world that was coming into being around Jesus' time. It was a world that was looking at the way in which society had been deeply corrupted by the presence of empires, first Greek and then Roman, compromising the standards of purity around their own priestly and legal and religious systems, and asking, what can we do to redraw those boundaries? What can we do to mediate holiness within our communities? And the answer increasingly became local gathering spaces called synagogues. So we have this framework, this really basic framework about what's going on. And when we think about the things that are crossing boundaries that don't belong, what is one of the things that comes up most for us, and I just named it, in this setting? Rome and empire at the very top of that list, aren't they? If there is anything unclean, right, about first century Judea, it's the presence of this group of people who believe that the social good is defined by their capacity to have power over other people around them, and how that power defines and reorganizes all human society to benefit them exclusively, right? If that sounds familiar, there's a good reason for that. We're wrestling with a very similar impulse when we're talking about white supremacy in our own culture, right? There is a really famous anthropologist. Her name is Mary Douglas, and she wrote a book called Purity and Danger in the 1960s, 1966, that really helped to kind of redefine the field of the study of religion around some important points, thinking through what is unclean, what is ritual impurity, but more than that, what do we mean when we're talking about things that represent uncleanness, and specifically with dirt? And we're going to put that quote up for you now because I think it's really helpful for us to hear. Mary Douglas says this. She says, if we can abstract pathogenicity and hygiene from our notion of dirt, we are left with the old definition of dirt as matter out of place. And she says, this is a very suggestive approach. It implies two conditions. First, a set of ordered relations and a contravention of that order. Right? Dirt then is never a unique, isolated event. Where there is dirt, there is a system. Dirt is the byproduct of a systematic ordering and classification of matter insofar as ordering involves rejecting inappropriate elements. I love that. I love that definition because it moves us past the simplistic idea of things as unclean because they're dirty, right? What is dirty? What is unclean? What is pollution? When we're thinking about what those things are in the context of our religious heritage in Christianity, we can start thinking about things like ritual separation. We can think about why none of us wants to read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, why they bore the hell out of us when we try to engage them, right? Because there are these endless lists of do's and do nots. Now, each one of those things on their own might not add up to much, right? It might seem that many of these rules are kind of arbitrary. Why is this shirt an abomination because it's a poly cotton blend, right? That seems sort of absurd to us today. But the thing is, all of those tedious rules add up to markers of cultural difference. So separating milk from meat on its own doesn't necessarily signal to someone that they're different, right? But if you throw in an injunction against shellfish, sorry, Red Lobster, and pork, sorry, Texas, then you're beginning to create a bigger picture about what it means to belong to the covenanted people of God. So that purity and pollution, the things that are clean and unclean, aren't just about specific objects being ritually safe for a community, and they're not about some kind of primitive idea of hygiene or medical safety. They're actually about creating boundaries and defining community, defining who is inside and who is outside, based on those markers of cultural difference. That's the basic idea behind purity and pollution. Mary Douglas did an amazing job in the 1960s really bringing that to light. When we think of our own context today, I want to say we glimpse both the possibility and the danger of this rhetoric, right? On the one hand, identifying an unclean spirit in a first century Judean synagogue might be a way of signaling the unwelcome presence of an empire that wants to suppress the actual religious life of a people. That could be what that means, right? On the other hand, if you are part of the Republican Party in January of 2020, and you are talking about the election being rigged or stolen or fraudulent, what is the subtext of those claims? A lot of people of color came out later and said, what they really mean when they say that is too many Black people and people of color voted. What is the boundary that's being maintained, and what is the narrative of purity and pollution at work in that instance? It's happening right under our noses right now as we speak. And I want to say there are two different ways of thinking about this, right? One group imagines that government, and our government in particular, exists to serve the needs and privileges of white people. The founding fathers were all white. They're all white European men. That's not propaganda for me. That's just a fact, right? And they wrote a constitution and established a government that perpetuated their power and their privilege. I mean, objectively, that's not an opinion. Again, just it was literally the law of the land. So on the one hand, if that is your view of the world, right, then the polluting force that is contaminating the reality that you hope to preserve is the presence of people of color who are different from you. That is the contaminating presence. On the other hand, if you believe that American democracy is actually about expanding the ever-growing union of people who are called into this big tent to belong to something greater than each of us individually that transcends things like race and class and everything else, then the contaminating force there isn't Black people voting, it's the opposite. It's racism, isn't it? And we see that discourse happening too on the other side of the aisle. And we see things like literally the boundaries being drawn in places like the House of Representatives with Marjorie Taylor Greene being potentially ejected from that body because the body needs to self-regulate. There need to be boundaries in place that actually establish some kind of common identity. And that common identity has to involve some kind of social good, higher than simply serving our own purposes and needs. Okay, this has been a lot, but I was really excited about this because I think it's an incredibly helpful lens into our own situation, into our own reality. And again, often it would be easy for us just to kind of wash over it or to pass over it in favor of a much easier interpretation. But that's what was speaking to my heart this week. I think it opens up a ton of questions for us about how we establish boundaries within our own communities, about how we establish boundaries in our own hearts, about our own ideas of what is clean and what is unclean, about how we participate in discourses and systems of purity and pollution, knowingly and unknowingly. And so right now, I want us to take time in the chat to have that conversation. Let's go a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, where do we see ourselves in the system? Where do we uphold that dichotomy at times? And where do we have an opportunity to scale back in some places and maybe reinforce in others for the sake of the actual health and well-being of the system? I'll see you on the other side of the chat.
1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard a tender whisper of love in the dead of night. You tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still into love, love, love. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
I hope you all know that I really mean it every single week. This is like the highlight of my week, being able to read your responses to these questions, because you are such a thoughtful and beautiful community. Every single one of you really brings such a different and valuable perspective to our conversation. You are a case study in why just plain old preaching in a unidirectional way doesn't make sense, because I learn at least as much from you as I know you do from me, and from each other as you do from me or anyone else. It is such a gift to see this conversation, this dialogue develop, and the rich insights that each of you are bringing from your own personal experience. Thank you for highlighting the challenges that we face, the question about how we identify, do we call ourselves Christian in an environment where that has been so deeply co-opted, around the real questions of mental health and the stigma that still exists around that. It's so important, around the increasing visibility of people of color, of different kinds of people than the sort of traditional heteronormative white type that we've been so used to in media, and how crucial representation is to moving the dial on any of these questions of justice. Sister Dana always bring the realness around the political authenticity, and just speaking about the truth of the kind of really hard situation we're in as a nation about what these boundaries actually look like and what they mean for us. Thank you, each of you, for bringing your whole selves to this community and for offering your beautiful and really valuable insights. Okay, there might be a casting call later in the week to be part of a film that we're producing for our big Cathedral gala called Carnival. It's a fundraising opportunity. We typically raise almost $500,000 a year. It's a big part of our Cathedral budget. I wasn't able to get the confirmed details from Catherine Thompson, who's the Canon Director of Development at Grace, but if I do get those from her soon, I'll forward them to all of you if you'd like to be part of this project that they're working on around developing a really fun video compilation of folks singing "Oh Happy Day" from the track of our own Sister Mass, which is pretty awesome. Jason, who's behind the scenes, Jason is amazing, has been working closely with us in terms of getting that together as well. So ping me or ping Jason if you're interested at all in that. As always, I want to invite you to like, share, and give. Those are all ways that you can support this ministry, that you can advance the work that we're trying to do at the Vine, to explore innovation and justice together in the context of a Christian worship service. And just thank you for being here. I love you all so much, and I can't wait to see you one day again in person. And until then, please be safe. Let's take a moment to close out in prayer one more time. Healing God, you know the things that are good for us and the things that are not. You know the boundaries that we ourselves cannot often see. I ask that you enter into those places that we gather, those places of community, that you enter into the inner sanctuary of our own hearts and help to redraw those boundaries. Help to heal us and to establish and restore boundaries that encourage safety and flourishing for all your people. God, you see us so fractured and torn. You see our deep divisions and the way that we are so quick to wound each other. Give us a different spirit, God. Lift the unclean spirit, which is antagonizing and infesting this nation. Give us open hearts towards each other. Make us soft and supple to the reality of our mutual suffering, to the challenge and the need to imagine a different world and to work towards living in that world by changing the one we're in today. God, thank you that the form of this present world is passing away. May we be agents of grace and truth in that process, bringing to light a new world that you call into being, even now. All this we lift up in Jesus' most holy and precious name, even as I ask the fullness of your benediction upon all those who are watching with us tonight. Thank you for this community. Thank you for your loving kindness. Be with us all, now and evermore. Amen.